And as they build up over time and then potentially colonize the individual, so now they've got a full-blown mold infection as well as this mold exposure, presumably if they're living in mold, that will then cause their toxic body burden to be higher. And low libido is a very common thing we see when this presentation is in the picture. On today's episode of the Modern Vital Podcast, we're going to talk about environmental toxins that can wreck your libido. But first of all, let's define libido. So it was first used by Sigmund Freud in 1894 to describe sexual desire. And basically, it signifies that instinctual, physiological energy that's associated with sexual urges and is known colloquially as sex drive, right? The loss of libido is a common condition. I see it a lot among my patients, especially post-pandemic. It seems to be a little bit worse for many people. And at certain stages for all human beings, one goes through it. For example, 1 in 5 men will experience it, and 1 in 3 women will experience it at some point. And this relates to the ages of 35 to 55. And they'll experience it for a prolonged period of time. So it's not just something that happens for a week, but maybe for a few months or even years. So let's talk about the factors involved in libido before we talk about environmental toxins. Of course, this podcast is about environmental toxins. There are biological, psychological, social, and environmental factors. Of course, this podcast, as I mentioned, is looking at the complex interplay of different elements, and the focus is on the environment. The most common factors that we can think of course, are stress and sleep, diet, alcohol and drug use, relationship issues, chronic illnesses, chronic disease, and of course, trauma. And when we talk about these things, we're talking more about poor diet, poor sleep, lots of stress, right? And this list is by no means exhaustive. So let's talk biology a little bit without getting too far into the weeds. When it comes to hormones, we know that testosterone plays a significant role in both sexes in libido. Also, neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, they also influence libido. For example, dopamine is involved in the reward center of our brain, right? And serotonin is a mood regulator, and that can influence libido in both regards. We also know that more than 50% of our dopamine is actually produced by the bacteria in our gut. And approximately 95% of our serotonin is made in our gut. So it goes without saying that if our gut is off or compromised, or our microbiome is offline, so to speak, then our sexual desire and our libido will probably be impacted. And of course, we have genetic predispositions. We talk about epigenetics a lot on this podcast. Epigenetics regulate our gene expression, and that could have an impact, for example, on DNA methylation. And that downstream could affect neurotransmitter levels and directly or indirectly influence libido. It's more indirect in this case. Now, psychological factors are probably the easiest to discuss. We already touched on some of them, and they're also easier to acknowledge. We know that stress and anxiety and depression can decrease, and in some cases even increase, sexual desire and libido. And of course, previous sexual experiences as well as trauma can impact and shape individual libido. This also can lead into relationship dynamics and emotional intimacy as topics, which directly impact libido. As far as social factors go, I like to think of the biopsychosocial spiritual model, where we look at distinct dimensions of the individual, and no single part can be separated or disaggregated from the whole person. And in holistic medicine, we have the word integer. It's where we get the word integrative, right? To integrate. And integer, we think of it in grade school, we learn about whole numbers, but it's directly related to the word for wholeness. And so when we talk about integrative medicine, we're talking about holistic medicine. In naturopathic medicine, we have our 6 principles, and one of them is tolle totem, which in Latin means treat the whole person. Basically, social factors, cultural, subcultural norms and values, media exposure, societal attitudes. These can all shape our perceptions and, of course, our expectations related to libido, and they can even potentially shape it. And there are obviously a lot of other really important factors like racial and gender discrimination. I like to talk about intersectionality, where we know that there's an interconnected nature to all social categorizations. And these identities can shape the individual experiences of discrimination and privilege and indirectly or directly impact libido. Now, as far as environmental factors go, which is the focus of this podcast, we have the environment of one's office and work culture. We have sudden life changes. These can impact libido. But we're going to get more into environmental toxins that can wreck libido. And I want to talk about 6. I mean, there's of course many more, but I want to talk about 6 environmental factors that can directly or indirectly impact libido and subsequently lower it. The first is probably the most famous. These are endocrine disruptors, and we've talked a little bit about BPA as one of the classical examples. These are also known as endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs. And basically, these can throw off our endocrine system, leading to hormone imbalance. And they can impair reproductive function. And of course, overall sexual desire and performance can be affected. Now, common EDCs include BPA or bisphenol A and phthalates. And BPA is commonly found in polycarbonate plastics, the lining of some metal cans, of course, receipts and thermal paper, and even dental sealants. There are many ways that endocrine disruption can happen. I see it a lot in my practice. I run a lot of toxicology screenings, and we see a lot of elevated BPA and other chemicals. But basically, these EDCs can mimic or block the action of the hormones at that receptor level in the cells. For example, let's talk about BPA. It can activate estrogen receptors. It has actually a similar structure to estrogen, particularly estradiol, which is one of the forms of estrogen. There are 3 main forms, and it can initiate estrogen signaling pathways in the cells, which can alter gene expression, right? That gets into our epigenetics, and drive a cellular response that is normally regulated by estrogen. And then, of course, downstream, it classically can lead to things like estrogen dominance, where there's too much estrogen signaling going on in the body. And we know that this, like a lever, will potentially suppress testosterone. And then, of course, there's a hormone imbalance, and then this can directly impact libido and lower it or diminish it. Now, phthalates are another famous type of endocrine disruptor. These are those plasticizers. I think of the PVC pipe or polyvinyl chloride pipe. I don't know if you've ever been to Burning Man in the desert, but there's a lot of PVC pipe that's put down into the sand, to put up these tents and structures. I know a lot of people try not to use it, but it can increase the toxin levels in the environment. Phthalates are found a lot in consumer and personal care products, household items. There's one famous example. It's called DEHP, or diethyl ethyl phthalate, and that can mimic or block the action of estrogen and even testosterone, as well as thyroid hormones. And this can throw off all the hormones and then, of course, lead to diminished libido. Now, phthalate exposure is also associated with a number of things, but one I want to highlight is vascular function can be impaired by exposure to these phthalates. And we know that this directly or indirectly can impact erectile function in males and females. A second category, let's move on, of environmental toxin that can wreck libido. Let's talk about heavy metals a little bit. We're not going to get too much into this, but the big 4 heavy metals, and we've talked a little bit about them on this podcast, are lead, mercury, cadmium, and arsenic. And all of them have been linked to sexual dysfunction and reproductive toxicity, and of course, diminished libido. They can accumulate in our body over time and drive up that total toxic burden in the body. And then they can interfere with hormone production and sperm quality, ovarian function, fertility. And of course, like we talked about, they can mediate or reduce libido as a cause. Now, mercury, let's talk about mercury a little bit in particular. It's known most famously for being neurotoxic, right? So it directly impacts our brain and our nervous system. And this can affect neurotransmitter production and breakdown. And then that can throw off our dopamine, our norepinephrine, our serotonin, etc., and potentially lead to low libido. Also, mercury, like the phthalates, is linked to vascular dysfunction. And we talked about how this can impact sexual arousal, and erectile dysfunction can be a downstream effect. A third category of environmental toxins that can wreck our libido is air pollution. And this is a really big one. We don't have much time to get into the weeds with it, but we think of particulate matter, right, from industrial processes. Nitrogen dioxide is a big one. VOCs, or volatile organic compounds, which are off-gassed from different industrial processes. And these are associated with adverse effects on sexual health. And chronic exposure over time can also impair, surprise, vascular function, and then it can drive that inflammatory cascade of cytokines and other cells in the body, which can drive inflammation. And then, of course, the balance of hormones can easily be disrupted, and this can lead to low libido. Nitrogen dioxide, in particular, also known as NO2, which comes from, mostly from motor vehicles and industrial off-gassing processes. Also, fossil fuel combustion, which is part of that. These can impair respiratory and cardiovascular function, which then can impact sexual function. We know that proper cardiovascular function is essential to sexual arousal, and this is why a lot of individuals with cardiovascular disease also experience sexual dysfunction, erectile dysfunction, low libido, etc. Endothelial dysfunction can result, there's the endothelial lining in the myocardium of the heart, in the heart muscle, in the cells. And this endothelial lining is connected to our blood vessel tone, and can directly impact blood pressure. And this can become dysregulated. And then that can lead to low libido and problems with sexual function and, of course, sexual arousal, which, as we mentioned, is part of libido. Oxidative stress is another big part. We get a lot of oxidative stress, which I think of that we've talked about this. It's like the smoke from the fire of inflammation. Nitrogen dioxide and other allergens and toxins in the environment can drive the oxidative stress to be much higher in the body. And over time, this will deplete our nutrients and our antioxidants, and this can lead to low libido because then we don't have the nutrients we need for protection and for having a healthy immune system and also building proteins in our body. A fourth category of environmental toxins that can wreck libido would be medications. There are a lot that are known, to cause potentially low libido as side effects. For example, certain diuretics and certain like SSRIs or antidepressants can potentially lead to low libido with chronic usage. And also, especially in certain predisposed individuals, which is why in holistic healthcare, we're looking at the whole person. Also, neurotransmitter levels are affected directly by things like SSRIs. And then we already talked about how the imbalance of neurotransmitters has an indirect impact on sexual function and libido. A fifth category of environmental toxin would be pesticides and herbicides. The most famous one, of course, is glyphosate, which we see in Roundup and GMO crops. I often see things like high atrazine in toxicology screenings of my patients. Atrazine is a chemical that is also in herbicides and pesticides, and it predominates on things like in places like golf courses. Actually, golf courses are the most heavily pesticide and herbicide laden places in the world. And I once had a patient who grew up on a golf course. I've actually had a couple, and we found, of course, or I shouldn't say of course, but we did find very high atrazine in their urine. It was connected back to decades ago, growing up on the golf course. And she, of course, had massive endocrine disruption in her body, as well as low libido. I shouldn't say of course, but she actually also happened to have, if I recall correctly, high BPA as well. So it's kind of strange to think that an Iowa or a Nebraska cornfield is actually a place that contains less herbicides and pesticides and things like glyphosate and atrazine than a golf course. Now, a sixth and lesser known category I like to talk about, which we talk about a lot on this podcast, is mycotoxins. These are those little bioweapons, I like to think of them. They're dead, they're not alive, and they're released by the living spores from mold. And they are so tiny. They're about 1/500th the size of a mold spore. And they can cause or mediate low libido. They're incredibly tiny, as I mentioned, and they can invade every organ of the body, especially the kidneys, the brain, the immune system. But they can even go into the endocrine system as well. And as they build up over time and then potentially colonize the individual, so now they've got a full-blown mold infection as well as this mold exposure, presumably if they're living in mold, that will then cause their toxic body burden to be higher. And low libido is a very common thing we see when this presentation is in the picture. Now, reducing exposure to these environmental toxins, of course, we do it through lifestyle changes, dietary choices, environmental protection. I recommend seeking out a holistic healthcare provider who specializes in this, like myself. Additionally, you can get guidance about other underlying health concerns that might predispose you to being susceptible to toxic exposure, and then of course leading to low libido. It's really important to recognize that individual experiences and circumstances vary widely. Libido can fluctuate according to multiple factors, age, health status, socioeconomic status, hormonal changes, etc. It's key that we address these factors to take that holistic approach. So that concludes today's episode of the Modern Vital Podcast. We'd really love to hear from you. We deeply value your feedback. If you have any questions or suggestions, please reach out to me at ben@modernvital.com. Also, please leave us a review if you enjoyed this episode. And we really look forward to having you join us next week for another exciting episode of the Modern Vital Podcast. And that's a wrap for today's episode of the Modern Vital Podcast. Your support fuels our mission to empower you on your quest for optimal health. Remember, our Modern Vital store offers supplements to guide you on your path to wellness. And don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share our podcast. Until next time, stay proactive on your health and wellness journey.